Welcome to another episode of Exploring Prosperity. In this interview, we're tackling a cornerstone of what once made America a land of opportunity: higher education. It used to be an engine of our cultural dominance, our economic prosperity, a ticket to a brighter tomorrow. But somewhere along the line, that promise started to crack. Costs are through the roof, trust is fading, and young people are wondering if it's even worth it anymore. In 2022, the Pew Research Center published a survey that showed that higher education ranked as the number 2 most pessimistic aspect of American society, behind morality. I'm honored to have been able to interview Pano Kanelos, the founding president of the University of Austin, or UATX. Pano is a scholar, a former president of St. John's College, and now the visionary behind a bold new university that's trying to rethink what higher education can be. He saw the fractures in the system and decided to do something about it, not just complain, but build anew. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did. Pano, thank you very much for hosting me at your campus today. Higher education used to symbolize American optimism and success. When did all that start to change?
That's a great question. First of all, thank you for the conversation today. I'm really excited to speak with you about University of Austin and higher education in general. These are my favorite topics. When did it change? When did we lose the sense of optimism? It's hard. I think it's hard to pinpoint, an exact moment in time. But I think what we've seen over the past 2 decades, really, and maybe this, sort of started, 2007, 2008, is a loss of confidence in institutions in general. The loss of confidence that the institutions that sort of make up the cornerstones of society, whether it's education or finance or religion, that those institutions are still functioning in a way that is promoting human stability and flourishing. And I don't think it was sudden. I don't think everything, like the lights went out in 2008. I think there's been a kind of gradual erosion. And if you do the math, you'll notice that here in 2025, a college freshman at the age of 18 was born in 2007, 2008. So this is the generation that has followed that financial crisis their whole lives. This is a generation that has never had full confidence in the social, cultural institutions of their own society. And so I think we're now at a point where as they're approaching university age, they're coming to university with a high degree of skepticism. So that's one possible answer to that question.
Yeah, fascinating timing. And so let's go through some of the problems that crept into the university system.
Oh, sure. Look, when we started University of Austin, we identified sort of 3 core crises that we thought had to be addressed. They're not the only crises. But broadly speaking, the first is a crisis of principles, that universities, to fulfill their purpose, which is the pursuit of truth, have to be committed to principles of open inquiry and civil discourse and freedom of conscience. And when universities no longer retain a robust commitment to those principles, the primary mission starts to unravel. So that's part of it. The financial model of higher education is broken, unsustainable, both for families and for institutions. So that has to be addressed. And I would actually say that the erosion of principles has something to do with the financial instability. We could talk about that.
And vice versa, incentives.
I think that's right, yeah. And then the third piece is the kind of curricular crisis, and that is that what we think of as the kind of standard American university academic model, curricular model, hasn't changed in about 130 years. All right. In the late 19th century, there was a kind of introduction into American higher education of the European research-oriented model for universities became the kind of standard. And this is where we saw the rise of things like majors and departments and that. It wasn't like that before. The insistence that people had to have PhDs to teach, these sorts of things were introduced into the kind of bloodstream of higher education in the late 19th century. That's the moment when we saw the foundation of schools like University of Chicago and Cornell and Hopkins, which were purposefully adopting in their founding the German research model. Even Harvard at that point, in the 1880s, Harvard went from being Harvard College, which was really kind of a traditional liberal arts college, focused on being a finishing school for the elites, to being Harvard University, adopting this research model that the others were adopting. Well, that created a kind of, a framework for undergraduate and graduate education that really hasn't changed. And here we are in, 2025, and the world's changed. In the information systems that we use to understand the world have changed. The nature of work has fundamentally changed. I mean, if you think about it, we live in a world where, the knowledge economy dominates the economy. Work at screens is predominant. And, at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, we were still in the old material economy, and nobody knew what a screen was or would be. So universities haven't really adapted in most cases to the situation we find ourselves in now. So there's the curricular problem, the financial problem, the principal problem. Those are the things that we tried to address as we founded the new university.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com. We're proud to be sponsored by Foundation. They've created Passport, one of the top-rated Bitcoin hardware wallets, proudly made in the USA. It's fully open source and air-gapped, meaning your Bitcoin stays completely offline and secure. The shocking Bybit exchange hack shows why holding some Bitcoin offline diversifies risk. Now they're launching Passport Prime, your all-in-one solution for not only Bitcoin, but all passwords and 2FA security. Head to foundation.xyz to secure your digital future. Tenure has a role in all of this as well.
Look, everybody likes to pick on tenure because I think fundamentally people realize that it's a sort of ridiculous phenomenon.
It's what we all want.
It's
that's only one walk of life that grants it.
Right. The idea that anybody gets a job for life where they no longer are responsible for their performance, is, I think, really rubs most people the wrong way because it just, it seems like a privilege that is granted unnecessarily.
And is so easily abused.
Well, easily abused.
Through lack of incentives and motivation.
Yeah, we don't have tenure at the University of Austin. The primary justification for tenure has always been academic freedom. So that, if you roll the tape back to the sort of early 20th century when the sort of roots of tenure began, the idea was that, you wanted to ensure that that scholars could pursue vectors of scholarship, areas of knowledge that may run crosswise to the people who held power at their institutions, so that they couldn't be punished for seeking to boldly explore difficult ideas. I think that's honorable.
Yes, with the intent to accelerate change.
That's honorable.
By allowing its expression.
Right. what happened was the poison pill with tenure isn't necessarily that somebody gets a job for life. I mean, I think that's a problem because it's disincentivizing and all that. But the real problem is that the tenure system is predicated upon people who have tenure hiring people who don't and then who are eligible for tenure. So the way the system works, of course, is senior tenured professors get to hire junior professors. Those junior professors run a 6 to 7 year gauntlet trying to achieve tenure. And if they pass muster, then they're granted a job for life by people who have a job for life. So you create a pipeline that invariably leads towards the hiring of people who are relatively aligned with the values of the kind of permanent professoriate institution. There's very little motivation to hire people you're going to disagree with. And even I don't necessarily think this has always been a kind of conscious, let's say, bias, but I do think that people naturally gravitate towards those that they're most comfortable with. So what you do is you hire people that you're comfortable with. You hire people whose ideas aren't going to challenge your own. You have this iterates over time so that more and more people are hiring people who they're comfortable with, and you end up with a single, kind of, like a kind of blob of conformity. And you can't fire any of those people because they'll have jobs for life. And that's why we've seen, everything. We've seen the percentage of faculty who are of one political persuasion tick, higher and higher every year. It's because of this tenure cycle.
Not to mention the incentives for the young professor being hired. Exact same thing in reverse. Even if you might disagree and want to take your research in a different direction, it's plain that there is a cost to that.
Absolutely. I mean, those who feel strongly that the kind of research they want to do, the kind of work they want to do isn't aligned with the expectations of the professor caste, learn early on in graduate school that graduate school is not worth it because you're going to work very, very hard and probably not get a job in this hyper-competitive job market. And even if you do, you're going to have to kind of go underground for a long time and somehow convince people that you're aligned with them. And then maybe if you get tenure, maybe you could sort of emerge, from your cave and be the person you always wanted to be, and it almost never happens. So at the very front of the process, even before the hiring begins, you have, young scholars who are dissuaded because of circumstance from even entering PhD programs. So this is, again, this all cycles in one direction.
Yeah, and you get a population shrink of one of the outcast and a population growth of the incast.
Yep.
And it's been relatively pervasive, hasn't it? The Jonathan Haidt, who's on your board of advisors, I believe, and Greg Luciana for a wonderful book, Coddling of the American Mind. Highly recommend it. And they talk about how broad this problem has become.
Yeah.
And it's not just the top elite institutions. What is the impact on the students of this process?
Well, the mind is a muscle. Muscles are strengthened by tension, by
Stress.
opposition, by stress. So for an educational institution to be fulfilling its purpose, it has to create an environment in which ideas are challenged, or ideas are, where you have the possibility to push and push back upon ideas. Yet if you create a kind of relatively homogeneous intellectual environment where there's kind of broad agreement among professors about what matters, why it matters, what should be included in terms of areas of inquiry, what should be excluded, what you have is a kind of homogenization of the knowledge creating process itself. And rather than things being allowed to challenge or to go crosswise, everything becomes about kind of conformity. You create a conformist intellectual environment So what happens in the classroom is that what students are encountering is they are presented with a particular way of thinking about the world, and they are discouraged from challenging those assumptions, sometimes even penalized if they challenge those assumptions, maybe by a professor, maybe by a peer group, maybe because somebody says something on social media. So we find students and faculty ever increasingly kind of sleepwalking through this thing we call education. There's a general passivity that creeps in to the process. Education loses dynamism. You know, for me, a truly successful class is when you begin the class with a set of assumptions and end the class with a different set of assumptions. I mean, that's learning. And if you're not providing that kind of opportunity for students, then I think you're failing them in terms of their intellectual growth.
And the worries that have been growing among young high school students that borrowing money or paying this price tag may not be worth it has been demonstrated increasingly over the last decade from lots of employer reporting that I've heard about.
Yeah. Look, as the price goes up, the ROI goes down. I mean, these are just numbers, you know.
And that's assuming that the outcomes are the same.
That's
if
right.
the outcomes start failing, then you get a double.
That's exactly right. And because, as I said earlier, because the curriculum at universities really hasn't adapted to the reality of the professional world today, the connection between what somebody thinks that they're learning at a university and what they actually need to learn in the real world is more and more tenuous. So you have this situation where you go to university, you have to pick a major. Ostensibly, you're at the university. One of the outcomes you expect is that it's going to lead to professional success. Hopefully there's more, hopefully it's also personal growth and, these sort of things. But one of the important outcomes is professional success. And you're presented with a slate of majors that have only a kind of loose connection to the real world. They're really, in almost all cases, majors are a kind of preparation to become a professor. A set of courses that are preparing you to become a professor in a particular discipline.
That's right. There is one use of what you're learning, right. And that is to teach other people the same thing.
And the irony is, we send young people to universities to prepare them for the rest of their lives, and they're taught by people who never leave universities. So sorting out what it is that you actually need to learn at a university to prepare to be successful for the rest of your life is key to the success of universities. When students understand that what they're actually learning and the experience they're having directly connects to their future flourishing, then the ROI is worth it. And I will say, I don't think that what they need to learn is specific technical skill-based learning for a job that's going to follow after they graduate. I think what they need to learn is they need to be sort of more deeply hardwired to be able to be critical thinkers, to be able to work together towards problem solving, to be communicators, to be ultimately education isn't about the transfer of information. It's about the transformation of somebody into a human being who has this capacity for prudence and for wisdom and for judgment and discernment. Those are the things you need that will actually make you successful, not only in your job, but in all walks of life. These things come together. I mean, if you're somebody who develops this thing we call wisdom, you're much more likely to do your job well over time. You're also much more likely to make choices that will rebound positively back upon your own life.
Yes, that addresses this. The role of the university is to teach you how to do something later, specific skills that can be used, or is it teaching you how to think and how to become a creator in whatever endeavor you encounter?
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to be surprised by my answer to that. I think it's the latter. First of all, it just, again, with the kind of rapidity of change in the world we live in today, the idea that you accumulate skills in 4 years of college and those skills somehow serve you in the professional world for the rest of your life is absurd. I mean,
Exactly.
Something you learned freshman year, a technical skill, is now obsolete by the time you graduate. 5 years ago, everybody wanted to learn how to code. Now AI does it, and it's going to continue to iterate. The technical skills actually can be acquired, kind of ad hoc along the way for the things that you need to do for the rest of your life.
And that is what good corporations are doing.
Right.
That. They're taking their people and they're training them in certain ways and retraining them so that they can continue to be productive in the direction the company is going.
Yeah. And the assumption is, the average person works 6, 7 different jobs over the course of their life, different fields. The idea you have to, the key to success is being able to be nimble and zigzag and learn new things. So what you need to teach young people is how to be nimble and zigzag and learn new things. You have to teach them the skill of learning, not necessarily a particular skill that's taught to them in the process of learning. Skill acquisition can help strengthen one's mental acuity and critical.
And some of the skills actually help you do what we're talking about.
But that shouldn't be the end in of itself.
Yeah.
Right. So, learning to become, a applied mathematician, right? Like it's that brain activity is in and of itself something that strengthens one's intellectual capacity. Whether or not you become a mathematician or work in that field, that's kind of inconsequential. Same thing with learning how to scan poetry, or interpret history.
Exactly. There's also, as the economy advances, specialization multiplies. Yeah. So even if you could train somebody today for jobs after graduation, you're getting a splintering of what all of those specific tasks would be. So it's a fool's errand to try and actually train people specifically for jobs afterward. Let's talk a little bit about UATX, and let's talk just about some of the basics of the structure, because I know part of what you're doing is preparing people specifically to be able to compete in the real world upon graduation with a program that's a little different from what most universities provide.
Sure. So, the very things we're talking about, like what are the ends of education? What do young people need? How does an institution provide the kind of structure to be transformative? These were the questions we were asking as we were developing the curriculum. What is it that we wanted to take and preserve from the existing models of higher education? What did we want to invent anew? And what we came up with, at least for undergraduates, was a structure that had sort of 3 essential components. The first is what we call the Intellectual Foundations program. And that is what students are mostly occupied with during their first 2 years. The Intellectual Foundations program presumes that in order to understand who we are today and where we need to go, we have to mine the human civilization that we've inherited. That there's this deep wealth of experience and knowledge, that there's so much that has preceded us and not just come before us, but that's actually made us who we are, that we have to come to understand if we're going to know who we want to be. So the Intellectual Foundations program takes the idea of a core curriculum and builds a kind of purposeful, sequenced liberal arts program around that, so that students are essentially following the great human questions across the arc of civilization and encountering the most compelling answers to those questions that we've come up with, sometimes encountering awful answers, but thinking about what is the origin of politics? What is justice? What is beauty? Where do ideas come from? And sort of tracing these questions through literature, through philosophy, through the sciences, through mathematics, so that we can come to understand how we come to understand. We use this term critical thinking all the time, and I think it's one of those slippery terms where people say it, but if you press them, they don't really know what it means. And one time I was in a university classroom at a school in Guatemala, of all places. I was visiting, and they had this seminar going on that I was sitting in on the students, and the topic of critical thinking came up, and the professor asked this young woman there, well, you just used that term, critical thinking. What is critical thinking? And she looked at him like it was obvious. And she said, critical thinking is thinking about thinking. In other words, coming to understand the kind of the workings of ideas and thoughts and the way that we operate intellectually, coming to understand it so that you could master it. I thought, that's perfect. So in some sense, our intellectual foundations program is why it's intellectual foundation is, coming to understand how to think about thinking, ideas about ideas, and how that manifests in other contexts. It's not just thinking as in, the way that we pose, let's say, philosophical questions, come up with answers. It's sort of like mastering, literacy itself, numeracy itself, understanding how symbols provide knowledge in symbolic ways. If you can come to understand that, you can come to understand the human experience. So sorry, I've gone on. I'm very proud of this program.
Yeah.
So that's what they do for the first 2 years. They're thinking in this way. They're reading books together. Students all read the same books together in the same sequence across the same classes so that they have this common intellectual journey. And only after a couple of years do we think they're ready to get more specific in the areas of knowledge that they're interested in. And so from that, they have a choice to branch into one of our 3 centers of academic inquiry, which are roughly groups of subjects that are in the humanities, the social sciences, and the STEM disciplines. But again, without like siloed walls between them, either internally or externally. So for example, we have a Center for Economics, Politics, and History. We believe that none of those disciplines is independent of the other. You have to kind of twine them all together, and that none of them really is very far away from disciplines outside the social sciences, like, the arts or philosophy or the hard sciences are all, if you really think about it, all intimately engaged in what we think about economics or history or that. So, again, it's thinking about the integration of knowledge. You have to plant your flag somewhere as you're trying to acquire knowledge. You have to have some kind of focus, because that kind of focus is a way to kind of concentrate our thinking. But you don't want to become kind of monomaniacal about like, well, I'm an historian and this is all I care about. I don't know. Those guys over in history, in economics, they have nothing to teach me, or the guys over in political science have nothing to teach me. We know that's not true. So after the first 2 years, they kind of branch into one of these centers of inquiry. And then the third component of our curriculum is what we call the Polaris Project. Polaris is the North Star. It's what gives us direction. This, I think, is probably the most innovative part of our curriculum, because what we said was like, look, the way young people experience universities now conventionally is that they get there and they're in this 120 credit delivery system, the end of which is something called a degree. And so they're just acquiring little chunks of credits in various formats and adding it all up. And that all adds up to this degree. To me, that's meaningless, right? So we had to think, well, what is it that you should be striving for? In other words, rather than a piece of paper or a certificate, some kind of validation, what is it that you should see as the through line of your education? And we decided that through line would be what we call a Polaris Project, which is a moonshot project that every student has to design for themselves from the moment they arrive at the university. So they start thinking about it. We help them think, help them reflect upon who they are, what their talents and skills are, what their ambitions are. We help them think about how to bring their greatest gifts to the world's greatest need. And when they do that, how are you going to do that in a tangible way? That becomes your North Star. So the students start to design the project in phases, and they're aiming towards the project. This North Star is our equivalent of a major. Because what it means is they're aiming to do that. All the classes they take, all the things they're trying to learn in their 4 years should be advancing them towards that.
Towards a goal that they have for themselves.
A goal they have
unique.
and something defined. So some of the Polaris projects, for example, we have a young woman who loves the ancient world and ancient languages. Her Polaris project is to teach 100,000 people how to read ancient Greek. That's a project. So how do you get there?
Wow.
And think about the things you have to learn along the way. How do you teach people? Is this involve technology? How do you market something like this? Is this a business? Is it a nonprofit? Is it, how are you going to assess things? Like, there's so many questions.
How about motivate 100,000 people that want to learn that?
Right. And you think about that, like all of those things that you have to pull together to achieve, that's real learning. Right. And so by the end of this experience, it's not that they've checked a box. I did, Econ 101. I did this and that. It's that they have advanced towards this goal. Now, frankly, whether they reach the goal or not in 4 years is not the important part.
Right.
The end product is, what have you learned along the way? Did you fail and have to get back up? Did you have to zig and zag?
How many times do you have to change?
How did you identify the resources you need? Mm-hmm. How did you take an abstract idea and turn it into a concrete plan? If you can learn all that, then you're set for the rest of your life. Like that's learning.
That's what it is.
Right.
That's what you did to create this university.
This was our Polaris project. I tell students that all the time. They're like, well, I'm like, this is our Polaris project. We set a goal. In fact, if you look at the symbol of UATX, we have a shield, and at the top of that shield over the city of Austin is the North Star. So that was our project. It is our project, I should say.
Fascinating. So you assembled, this idea was germinating as you were running another college. And you have assembled an incredible team of advisors and board members. Some of those board members, Barry Weiss, very obvious connection to the idea of we need to be able to think and speak and offer ideas that challenge the status quo. And Jonathan Haidt, along with Greg Lukianoff, authors of A Coddling of the American Mind, wonderful book, had their formative thinking towards the creation of this. What was yours?
Well, that's a great question. I think what draws together all the folks who are on our advisory board or our board of trustees, people like Barry or Neil Ferguson or, Richard Dawkins or Larry Summers, Glenn Lowry, Ayan Hersey Ali. I mean, these are incredible people. What they have in common is that they're ultimately heterodox. In other words, their success is predicated upon being able to think outside the box or differently than the people around them, and then persuading others that they should do the same. My experience at universities, and I've been at universities for almost 3 decades now as a professor, then a dean, then a college president now in this role, has been one of always being slightly askew from my colleagues, my fellow scholars, the institutions I'm at, largely because I've never been able to stop asking questions.
It gets you in big trouble.
It gets you in trouble. But it's fun, and it seems to me to be the purpose of higher education. And so whatever it was, my field is Shakespeare, and so when I was really doing a lot of scholarly work before I got sort of vacuumed into the world of administration, all of my scholarly friends were writing on the sort of same set of topics. It was all increasingly about things that are political or ideological and all that. And I insisted on writing about the sort of formal qualities of Shakespeare's poetic language. Nobody does that anymore. But it just seemed it just seemed like it's something I wanted to do. It was sort of beautiful. So I've always just been inclined to kind of sit askew from what's going on around me. And I think, even when I was president at St. John's College before here, which is a really wonderful institution, it's a historic liberal arts college, has an entirely great books curriculum, a very serious place. Even when I was there and then absorbed by that kind of method of education that all you do is read books and talk about books, it's hyper intellectual. I was slightly askew. I was sort of like, I love this. I love the life of the mind, but how do we translate that? How do we take the life of the mind and translate into life in general? We're not all going to live these monastic, ascetic, intellectual lives. How do we do that? So it's always, even at that institution, I was slightly askew. And so when you are somebody who's constantly asking questions, you become somebody who has to find answers. And so this university, it was my attempt to find answers to questions that seemed important to me.
How did you connect with everybody? How did the germ of the idea start?
My entry point into it, I was still at St. John's as president. A friend of mine connected me with Barry Weiss for a Zoom call. Barry wanted to talk to a college president because she had some things on her mind and questions about what was going on in higher education. That conversation snowballed into a very, very long conversation about higher education, at the end of which she said, we should really start a new university. These places are massively screwed up. And I said, that's a great idea. Let me know how it goes. I'll be on your advisory board, whatever you want. She's like, no, we should do this and you should be the president. I thought, I don't know if I've got a family, I got a job. And so she encouraged me to talk to a couple other people that, again, we all been sort of thinking about these issues separately, but she knew people who were thinking about the possibility of starting the university, Joe Lonsdale, Neil Ferguson. And so she sort of, encouraged me to sort of join this conversation. And that was really where it grew out of.
Interesting. Yeah, I thought there had to be, I was wondering where the motivation source was and the energy source, because these projects, was there an alternative to work inside a system, or was it sounds like it was pretty early on.
Yeah, look, the problem with working inside is these systems are so vast and complex that you don't even know where to begin. How do you, for example, solve the problem of a lack of intellectual pluralism in a system where 95% of the professors already believe the same thing? I mean, just to sort of, even if you were fully committed to hiring people who had different belief systems, different politics, take generations before you can sort of dilute the kind of dominant way of thinking at those
with a vastly uncertain outcome, because really, who knows if they could all agree. 95% could agree tomorrow. Okay, we'll bring in some people, and next week they change their mind.
Yeah. And the bureaucracies of these institutions are so entrenched, and I mean, this was before Doge, when apparently you could just go in and smash bureaucracies with a sledgehammer. So maybe I would have felt differently, once at this point, but. Yeah, the lift seemed too heavy. Let's put it this way. If starting a brand new university from the ground up seemed easier than changing existing universities, that says everything you need to know about existing universities. Because starting a university from the ground up is not exactly easy.
No, it also speaks to how big the goal is and how important the goal is.
Yeah.
Right. To restore intellectual freedom is a big idea. And if it weren't a big idea, then it wouldn't be worth undertaking. So it's both a comment about how big the idea is and also how difficult it is to escape or to change the evolved system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me about yourself. What is it so your childhood, your family, moving down here must have been, how did you decide on Austin?
Well, that just emerged in our conversations. I mean, if you're going to build a brand new university, Austin's really an ideal place. I mean, it's a, emerging city, a growing city, so many heterodox thinkers in all different fields are congregating here. It's a place young people want to be. I mean, there were just all sorts of good reasons to be in Austin. So that wasn't very difficult. And it wasn't very difficult to move here. I mean, I've made a lot of moves in my life, so you become sort of flexible over time. Yeah, my early life, I was born in Chicago and born into a family, immigrant background from Greece. And very kind of connected to that community as I was growing up, family in the restaurant business. Because when you're Greek and you get off the boat, they hand you the keys to a restaurant. That's just how it works. And, my parents were not educated beyond. My mom had high school equivalent education, my father less than that. Nobody had ever been to a university in my immediate or extended family. So I was the first in ever generationally to go to university. So that was a major thing. And for me, doing that was transformative because it not only opened up a world that I had been beyond my horizon, but it also felt, I mean, the immense privilege of being able to take that step in a family where nobody had been able to do that, persuaded me that I had to do something important with that privilege. I mean, that's real privilege. I mean, if you're a university student in 21st century America, you're among the most privileged people who's ever lived on the planet. You have something that most people will never have, this particular kind of gift. And if you don't take that seriously, then you are, you're really depriving yourself in the world of something very important. So that was, so I made it to university, and then I just I liked it, so I stuck around.
And so you wanted to be a teacher.
Yeah.
and the early days of teaching, rewarding and fulfilling because you could see how an impact that you were making. And
my early days of teaching were a complete disaster. I did a program called Teach for America, so right after when I graduated college, and they sent me to teach actually in Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley on the border, in these impoverished border towns, schools there, mostly migrant farm working families. I didn't speak Spanish. And it was 7th and 8th grade, which is just a challenge under any circumstances. So
kids were beginning to get dangerous.
They just, oh my goodness, they just walked all over me, and I was terrible, and it was demoralizing, and it was rough. That was probably it was easier. It's easier to start a new university than to teach 7th and 8th grade. I'll just say that. So my first experience was humbling. It was extremely humbling. But then after that stint, I decided to go into graduate school, and then when I started teaching at the university level, it's night and day. And loved it, and have always loved teaching, and always been just enlivened by that experience in the classroom. And I think what makes a good teacher is someone who goes in the room not to teach but to learn. There are very few times I can remember going in the classroom and not learning something myself.
Yeah, you walk in with some material and you come back with a whole bunch of interactions and thoughts that.
And if you approach teaching that way, if you say, my job here is not to sort of impart some kind of, some quantity of knowledge on this group of students. My job in this room is to leave here having learned something myself from the minds that are in the room. You teach very differently.
Reminds me of, I interviewed an economic historian, and he said, we think about today's prosperity in terms of billionaires and private jets. An economic historian looks at it in a different way, that in only 225 years, we've moved from a humanity where 99% of all people were born into poverty and lived subsistence. Today, that's only 8%. And so we've freed up the minds of 92% of humanity to be able to think, create, produce, interact. And you walk into every class, every lecture, and you walk out learning something about what somebody said, the changes you were thinking about that topic. It reinforces this idea that
we're probably at a very good point.
Yeah. Well, it compounds over time. Knowledge compounds and creates more knowledge. Again, I'm not sure that that equates with, let's say, moral advancement, or ethical advancement. I'm not persuaded. Those 99% of people who were born into poverty 2 centuries ago or a century and a half ago, it may be that 99% of people today are born in a kind of into moral poverty or ethical poverty, that we're not attuned to, let's say, the deepest needs and values of humanity. We're distracted by our prosperity. I'm not saying this is inevitable, but I grew up going back to Greece and the village back to the town where relatives lived in, and these were poor, uneducated people. But in many ways, their life was so rich and so alive. And, you'd come back to the States and we had so much, but it was sort of like The Walking Dead. And so there are trade-offs.
Yeah, you think about the roads with houses apart from each other instead of the village where everybody depended on each other.
Yeah. And look, I don't want to, paint a kind of idealistic picture. There's a lot of problems being poor in a village, and people aren't necessarily all nice and good to each other. But there was a kind of intensity to life, a kind of a being attuned to like just the rough edges of humanity that we lose with our prosperity. We become numb. In many ways, the modern world is the land of the lotus eaters. We're kind of half asleep. So, yes, we're healthier, wealthier, we live longer. Those are all good things, but they're only good things if we also stay attuned to what it really means to be a human being.
When you say half asleep, does that mean that that half the people are asleep, or everybody's half asleep, or how are you thinking about?
I don't know about the distribution, but here's what I would think.
Yeah.
It's like, here we are, we work, we're prosperous, we have all our needs met, we're secure, we have endless possibilities in front of us, and we spend on average 7.2 hours a day staring into a screen. That's half asleep. Half asleep. And what's even more tragic is that's we don't do that out of necessity. We do it out of some sort of ennui.
Is there a difference between today's 7 hours and the 7 hours that the kids were doing in the 60s or 70s with television?
No, I think there's a continuum there. Yeah,
I think it's in the same ballpark. They're definitely one of the more pernicious parts about today is that the companies are able to know what you want and deliver it to you rather than the same program to millions of people. So that's concerning and pernicious.
It's several degrees more solipsistic. Right, it's the black mirror. You see yourself as reflected back upon you. Mm-hmm. So there's that issue. The other issue is, it was really hard to fit the TV that I had in my living room as a kid, which was this big and this wide, in my pocket and take it with me everywhere I went.
That is true. So you didn't try, did you?
So the idea that the screens are actually kind of appendages now. That we sort of live with them all the time. Wake up in the morning, the first thing we do is check our email.
And you spoke about morality to start this thought process.
Yeah.
And how is the morality connected to the screens, if it is? Or is it a different subject?
Well, that's a great question. I think one way that it's connected is that I do think this kind of screen culture is ultimately narcissistic or solipsistic. We more and more intensely focus on ourselves and our own needs. And I think the fundamental premise of moral action is being attentive to the
Selfless.
other. Yeah. So, I think that's part of it.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Television doesn't do that at all.
No.
It's you can lose yourself in television, but it's a totally different nature.
Yeah, again, it's a continuum. I mean, I think they're connected to each other. I mean, I don't think it was great that I was watching 7 hours of TV when I was a kid either.
Oh, I didn't know you were.
Yeah, I did, or however many. I mean, I think I think whatever is a continuum.
I'll bet you and I were a little less than the 7 hours, which was apparently the average back then.
Maybe.
I remember being so shocked about.
Yeah,
but
possibly
got my share in.
Although only because my dad was making me peel potatoes in the back of the restaurant. That's why I wasn't in the front of the TV.
We were talking earlier about classes and having everybody sharing the great works of how we think about the big issues in life. One of the benefits that you all probably can measure here, I would guess, is that the discourse becomes an intellectual exercise rather than an emotional one. And one of the problems I think today is that too much of our arguments are emotional at the start and at the base, and that they're not intellectual. And I imagine that putting college students through an intellectual exercise about examining the thought leaders of the past allows you to speak on the terms of the intellectual side without having the emotional side need to get involved. And if it does, it's at the tail end and it's not a big deal.
I think you make a great point. I guess one way I would frame it is too often today our conversations aren't intellectual, they're rhetorical, in that the purpose of the conversation is to persuade another person or other people that your idea is the better idea, right? And it's a kind of you have a kind of total commitment to a position, and you just want to make your commitment in a more forceful way than the other side has made. That isn't what I would call intellectual, right? What I would call intellectual is dialogic. In other words, I have an idea or a set of ideas, you do as well. Let's put those in communication with each other. And the end of which is not that I win or you win, but that we both win if we come up with better ideas.
And that we understand why you think what you think.
I mean, and this should just be intuitive, because I think we all know, or we should know, that we're not right about most things. I mean, I'm wrong about most things most of the time. So the idea that I begin a conversation with a fixed position is foolish. I can certainly begin a conversation saying, this is how things seem to me. Let me express this to you. But if I don't have an openness, if I don't have a kind of elasticity that allows me to say, wait a second, that's actually interesting what you just said, and it might be a little bit better than what I said, or if it's not better, it helps me reflect differently on what I think. Again, it goes back to that model of pedagogy in the classroom. You should end a conversation learning something, not proving something.
That's a great way of saying it. So let's put this in the context of your students and go forward 10, 20 years. How does UATX wind up having the biggest impact?
I mean, directly related to the students, I would say one of our convictions when we built the university is that, and we talked about this earlier, that our institutions, the kind of components of culture are coming apart, that the things all around us seem to be disintegrating. People are moving farther apart from each other. The cohesive quality of society is being lost. Everything's crumbling. And what do you do in times like this? Only thing to do in times like this, when everything is crumbling, is to build anew. You have a calling to build up and build anew. That's the impetus for the university, and that is transferred to our students, because our intention with the students in building a new university is to create a generation of builders and creators and innovators. So that Polaris Project, the things that we're doing, is intended to prepare and equip young people to go out in the world and contribute and create. So, if we're successfully educating young people and motivating them to take on that responsibility, then we're going to graduate generations of builders who will help us recompose the core elements of society. There will be other people who will found other things, and and young people who will solve problems. And, as we do that, I think we create the possibility for renewal. So, other universities, you ask them, like, what does it mean to be successful? They'll say, well, we want to make sure that our students are earning in the top 20% of earning. I don't care about that. I really don't.
No.
That's not what makes a successful life. What makes a successful life is living a life that you feel is infused with meaning and purpose. That's the end goal. So that's what I hope, is that we're going to generate new waves of renewal through the students. But also beyond that, apart from the individual students, that by modeling the kind of education that we're offering, that we're going to create a renewal in higher education itself. We've seen this in the past. We've seen that in moments in time when new institutions sprout up, you have a kind of change of paradigm. It's what happened, as I said earlier, in the end of the 19th century. How do we initiate a kind of new flourishing, blossoming of new institutions? So one of my goals is to pave the way for all my competitors who are waiting in the wings now. I want to see 100 new universities open up, and they all doing things in a different way, a heterogeneous constellation of new institutions, because that's what's good for us as a people. It's what's good for higher education.
It'll be good to see the costs come down. You guys have been fantastic at raising a lot of money, and hopefully that's going to continue. I know people have talked about that as a negative, both for your scaling and for some belief that you're going to be beholden to individual donors. How is that fundraising plan? I imagine that you want to spread out and get as many individual contributors as possible.
Yeah, I mean, we have over 3,000 donors right now, which, given that we don't have a single alum, is not too bad, right? And a significant number of that group, a smaller subset, are
so the average per alum is pretty high.
Average is pretty high, yeah. And we have 150, 160 major donors, I would call them. So it is spread out. I'll be honest with you, the only reason to give money to our institution is because you believe in the mission. So our donors aren't generally asking us to do things that are beyond what we intend to do, and I haven't encountered that. And to be frank, I mean, in all the years I've been in higher education, president of other institutions raising money, I've almost never encountered donors who are really heavy-handed. I think that's a pretty rare phenomenon, to be honest.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think donors do see themselves as stewards and philanthropists in that. I don't think that's a major, challenge for us.
How's your second class shaping up? Have the letters gone out?
Some have. Well, we've been through the early decision process, so those students have been informed. Our regular decision ended the first. We have 2 rounds of regular decision ended February 15th. So those have not. We're still in the process of reviewing that batch, so those will go out probably in a few weeks. Looks great. I mean, look, we have extraordinary students already, and we're going to have even more.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah.
Is there a concentration from Texas, and is that spreading out at all?
So about 40% of our students are from Texas, 60% from the rest of the country. We're not yet authorized to have international students. That takes a couple of years. That's a federal visa process that you have to go through.
Yeah.
Because you have to be able to grant student visas, so you have to you have to go through a process of getting that standing. Although we do have 3 international students, we snuck them in, but only because they had dual citizenship. So we have a student from Germany, one from Argentina, and one from Turkey. And as we go in the future, I think we'll see more international students when we can bring them in. And then, it looks like in this next class that we're going to shift even more towards a national student body, probably 70 or 80%. So we're pleased with that distribution.
Well, this is fantastic. It's been terrific spending time with you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me to your campus, and I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm really happy that we had this conversation.
Me too. Thank you for coming, and thank you for a great conversation. You made my day.
Thank you.
If you like this video, please hit like, subscribe, and leave any comments you might have. You might also want to check out some of my other interviews. We try to dig into the problems that make Americans so pessimistic about the next generation, but we also interview people whose work doesn't get the headlines, but they make life better for society every day. Given humanity's steady progress over the last 275 years, it's likely that there's never been a better time to have been born than today. Join us for perspectives on today's challenges and opportunities.